Good afternoon. I'm Joe Pryweller, Conference Director for Plastics News. I want to welcome you to the first in an ongoing series of Fireside Chats, fueled by M. Holland and produced by Plastics News. You are part of an exciting new streaming event where you'll hear live, casual conversations with leading experts on a variety of significant topics. We will be streaming this video broadcast via YouTube Live, and you will have the opportunity to ask questions in real time and receive on-air responses. To participate in this live chat, you must have a Google account with an associated YouTube channel. If you do not have a Google account, you can either create one or add a YouTube channel to an existing account. You can type questions in the live chat box to the right of your screen anytime during the presentation. I'll be standing off stage and will direct your questions to our speakers. Today's live chat will feature a spirited discussion on automotive trends for vehicle interiors from two differing perspectives, the consumer use experience and materials selection. We will not only focus on what is emerging in today's automotive interiors landscape, but also the effect of future disruptive technology on both vehicle interior design and material choices. Our conversation features John Zesson, Managing Director of M. Holland Automotive, and Renee Pipple, Director of Strategic Research for Yanfeng Automotive Interiors. John Zesson has spent his entire 34-year career in automotive plastics. He has successful tenures with 3 major resin producers before launching Polymer Z, a full product line resin distributor, in 2003. Polymer Z was acquired by M. Holland in 2015 and changed its name to M. Holland Automotive. Renee Pipple has been an advocate for the end user for more than 16 years, as she and her team at Yanfeng Automotive Interiors continuously strive to influence the future of interiors by putting the consumer first in the minds of designers, product developers, and business builders. She is dedicated to identifying end-user-based solutions that challenge and provoke the way we think about automotive environments. I'll now step back and let our speakers do the talking and take the stage while I move off screen. Let me turn this live conversation over to John Zesson of M. Holland Automotive. John, take it away.
Thank you, Joe. And I'd like to start out by thanking Plastic News for hosting this first of our live stream Fireside Chats. I'd also like to thank our live stream audience for being part of this. I hope you find that this is going to be helpful and maybe productive and provocative in your thoughts about what happens to interiors in the future. And then finally, I'd like to thank Renee Pipple for joining us today to provide some expertise from the consumer end user perspective of how interiors are designed and what the considerations are for those designs. So with that said, Renee and I share some background, we share some interests, and we share some passions in this industry. And let me just dispose of the first. We are both products of great Michigan schools in the MIAA, I from Albion College, and of course Renee from Hope College, the Flying Dutchman.
That's correct.
So with that background, you can be assured that this is a panel of experts to start out with. I'd like to start out with our second interest, and that is the interest of automotive interiors. And as we think about automotive interiors from a raw material perspective, we look at it perhaps a little bit differently, but we take a lot of our cues from the people who are trying to satisfy the end consumer demands, in this particular case being Yanfeng. So maybe you can start with giving us somewhat of a baseline of the things that are involved in trying to create those interiors that are going to please the consumer's demands for today, and then we'll get into a discussion about where that's going to go in the future.
Sure, thanks, John. I would say the broader question of how do you come up with an interior that's not only going to service or satisfy the end consumer, but also ultimately the OE manufacturer. At Yanfeng, we don't do total interiors. We do focus on 5 different product zones. So within those areas, obviously there are a number of things that come into play when ultimately trying to deliver the best product possible to our customer and then ultimately to the end consumer. Whether it's dealing with cost or regulations, standards, responding to market demands, exploring what new technologies are on the horizon, all of those come into play. With my group, though, with really focusing on the end user, we obviously are really trying to promote ultimately what that occupant of that vehicle is going to expect or continue to demand in the future with regard to connectivity, comfort, quality, safety, creature comforts and conveniences when they get into that vehicle, that interior is not only getting them from A to B safely, but also providing an environment in which it's enabling them to do that in the most productive, effective, and comfortable way possible.
Well, it's interesting because as you discuss that, I can more know that the things that are demanded of the raw material suppliers come from those things that you're talking about, because the same language that gets used in your business gets used in ours. So we obviously are involved in all the elements of aesthetics, of comfort, of safety, and those translate down into raw material properties that are required to create those things. And so the products that we provide are not only products that need to be processable in a manufacturing environment, but also have to end up creating an environment that's pleasing to the consumer. So it's interesting how the dynamics of what you do play into
Absolutely.
the requirements of what we have. And so as we think about those things in today's environment, most of those things we understand, not all of them, and those are ever changing. I can tell you from my perspective, in the time that I've been in interiors, there have been a number of things that have caused change over time. That whether it be government regulation, whether it be an increased emphasis on safety, which certainly we've seen over the last 20 years especially, to aesthetics, to comfort, to feel haptics. And so we're anticipating that there's going to be no shortage of those coming down the road either with the new changes that we see.
Exactly. And I think, we mentioned at the start the emerging technologies and disruptors that are taking place in the industry are only going to increase some of those expectations within the interior. We've spoken about autonomous and how disruptive that will eventually be across the board, as far as not only materials but expectations, how that interior is going to be used. I'm sure that presents a whole new set of challenges that you guys are having to start to think about.
We are. Obviously, we have to put ourselves in a place to better understand by working with companies
Yep.
like yours to get what your vision is going to be for the future, and then translate that into is that cockpit going to need more heat? Is it going to need more impact? Is it going to need less impact? Are the surfaces that are in that vehicle tomorrow going to be active
Right.
more so than they are today? And what does that mean for raw material choices as well? So there's going to be this ongoing dialogue beyond this room today that's going to be important for us to be able to determine what the right materials are for the future. But, you mentioned autonomous, which is probably the big elephant in the room
Right.
as far as the way everybody looks at future vehicles and the way interiors are going to be laid out. Let's talk a little bit about, those things. What do you envision with autonomous vehicles that might create change, dynamic in designing new interiors?
What is it not going to change? I would say what a exciting frontier as an interior supplier to have on the horizon, as far as really shifting the paradigm of importance placed on the interior far more than we probably have ever seen in years past. And the big question always is, what are people going to do or want to do, and how is the vehicle interior going to need to respond accordingly? I think, first of all, the biggest thing is just thinking about, in today's interior, the driver's seat is the most important seat because you have to drive. And then kind of cascading out from there, everything else is designed really around that, when it comes to creature comforts or reach zones or where information is presented, how it's directed to the driver. Well, if you no longer have to drive, you're no longer then held to those specs as far as designing an interior around that kind of hot spot. So seating configurations and exchange of information. Today, how we define certain product zones. probably won't even have the same same definition anymore. There's going to be a lot of blurring of the center console to the seat, to the relationship to the IP, to how the doors are viewed or accessed or interacted with. Will there be 3 doors or 7 doors? I don't know, but I just think fundamentally that interior is going to no longer be challenged with, first and foremost, enabling the task of driving and keeping the occupant safe. But now, what is it going to enable? Because the desires or demands of that, the behaviors that are going to, and consumers are going to want to participate in, are going to be entirely different. So that just starts the discussion as far as what we're going to do.
Is the center console now going to be a coffee table?
Exactly, right.
And
there's going to be a chest of drawers or a closet somewhere. Or,
and so how does that, for us, play out into material usage and how that particular element of the interior gets used versus the way it is today? And today there may be more stagnancy in that interior than where it is down the road, which means that there's probably a need for more durability in that interior in the future than even maybe there is today. There's always a great emphasis on durability today, but in the future, if there's more moving parts and there's an element of more abuse to various parts of the interior, then I think durability is going to be an important requirement that we're going to have to look at and say, are the materials that we're using today with polypropylene adequate materials, or are we going to have to go to something that has a higher impact that's going to live longer in that vehicle that might be the right material in the future? So that you can see how some of the things that you're doing are going to certainly impact things that we're doing in the future.
Yeah, there's obviously no scientific method to this is what the consumer wants and this is the exact solution to it. So there's going to be, I would imagine in the years to come, a lot of just figuring out what that balance is, whether it's responding to durability, we had also talked about the notion of cleanability or antimicrobial, or whether it's in a mobility scenario of a vehicle that you own or something like a ride sharing or car sharing, and how that plays into various high touch points in the interior and what the consumer is going to expect from that.
And just time, that driver's seat is still going to be one of the most important seats. Now, how that gets reconfigured back into the living room setting and back into the driver's position, I guess, is a challenge that you'll have to look at. But also, we as well, in terms of what does that mean for raw materials that get used to build that seat that is reconfigurable that way and has the strength to move from one position to the next.
Right.
So again, then we have to think about greater impact material, maybe materials with stronger modulus, long glass fiber products that maybe aren't used in those areas today, but might be used in those areas in the future. But as we think about that government regulation, and it certainly drives material decision for us today, we can't do anything in the interior without understanding the FMVSS 201 standards and what that means for raw materials on the interior of the vehicle. And we obviously have to understand head impact criteria and a number of other elements that go into material selection in the car today. I got to imagine that in the future, if we have what is supposed to be a safer, lower impact environment for driving, that are all those requirements still going to be part of what we do in the future? Is there still going to be the same need for head impact criteria? Are you going to have to put as many airbags in a vehicle that doesn't have as much impact potential as the current vehicles today?
Right.
Or if, in fact, they do have that impact ability at lower speed? And so, how does that affect things now when maybe there's not going to be the same emphasis on airbags in the interior down the road?
Yeah, The vehicle that we just shared most recently at the North American Auto Show, Experience in Motion, or XIM 17, we got a lot of questions from our customers about that. The vehicle was, I guess, as SAE autonomous levels would be referred to, it would be at like a level 4, where you still have the ability to drive it, but then you also have the ability to have it drive for you autonomously. But there are still, I mean, those questions come up all the time, whether it's seat belts, are those still going to be required, airbags, what's, where in the placement of them, if the seats are moving away from the IP, how does that impact the airbag release and
Right.
no longer an occupant is sitting there if need be. So I don't, being an interior supplier, we do our best, obviously, to just keep up with what are the questions being asked, the standards that are being set forward, the projections or expectations from government and legislation. But we also just continue to be mindful of us being ready as a supplier to the belief that, we believe someday that in the near future, the customers are going to start coming towards us and asking for some of these more innovative solutions. And like you said, it probably will be a gradual evolutionary approach, but with almost all of the customers, announcing that within the next 3 to 5 years, they'll have a vehicle on the road that's got this capability. As a global interior supplier, we've got to be able to respond accordingly. And maybe the driver's seat will stay in that position, but there's some innovative ways of being able to shift seats around while still following regulations right now, to still offer an environment that's a little bit more conversational, that opens up space with the occupants to be able to see each other a little bit more easier. So even playing kind of it within that realm still, and the constraints still today, there's still a lot of innovation opportunities that we've got to explore.
Observed areas of the vehicle are seats and instrument panels.
Right.
And so when you look at the instrument panel, I think seats, obviously, we've touched on configuration, reconfiguration, the ability to have flexible seating systems, perhaps even, airline type seats which recline into beds for a long road trip. But in the instrument panel, I think that's an interesting dynamic for the information that's being provided through that particular area of the vehicle. And now if the attention is away from that area,
Right.
Then what happens with information that's transmitted from that side to where does it get transmitted? Is the IP in the longer revolution still a viable application area? And if not, then there's a number of things that change from a raw material perspective for us on the cockpit, and how that's going to get used, and how what it's going to be used for. Even the idea that if the propulsion systems for these are electric engines, the engine heat that comes in from today into the car has to somehow be contained and absorbed on the interior, in the interior firewall. Without that, now we have a different set of conditions.
Absolutely.
That maybe that requirement isn't there, but some other requirement is. The idea of windshields versus rear windows versus side windows,
Or complete display screens.
complete display screens
Right,
around the whole.
right.
So I think that as we look at this, it's really interesting where it's going to go and what challenges it's going to provide from a raw material perspective.
The IP discussion is really interesting one. It's obviously one of our 5 product zones that we provide to our customers. And, it's kind of an internal debate a little bit about there's a lot of value in that IP, like you stated, for safety components, structural, all of the information that's presented in there, even down to kind of setting the theme for the interior as far as design theme and aesthetics. But in the future, does that change somehow? Is it not have as much value anymore, or are the surfaces transformed into something that it's not just plastic parts anymore? It's a smart surface, or it's a full display screen. We talked about, if the seating configuration is going to change and you're essentially moving away from then that IP and ultimately away from where traditional information and interaction spots are on that IP, then that has to come with you somehow. And is that information traveling down the doors? And now the doors are becoming of greater value or importance to the occupants in that vehicle. Does some of that information travel to the table, like you said, or the center console, or whatever that is, that kind of hub part of the interior, the middle of the vehicle? There are a lot of endless opportunities, but I think that whole notion of smart surfaces or non-traditional surfaces in the interior taking on now a different role and becoming of greater importance and a value add to the occupants in that vehicle, I think it's certainly something, there's a lot of white space to play around there with and coming up with some new innovations and opportunities.
Yeah. And through that course of that conversation, I think what also is out there for us to evaluate is there's obviously been new players that are announcing their entry into the game. Those new players may or may not have some of the legacy concepts of interiors.
Right.
That may or may not be good. It may not be anything other than different. And so, can you put yourself out there where you say, okay, what might that be if there doesn't be a traditional interior and somebody else is thinking about a different way to do this completely than what we've seen before? Do you envision something like that as part of this?
Well, I think with some of those new players that are emerging or have emerged or are on the horizon, it seems as though they're kind of tackling the build from a totally different perspective. A lot of them are more software and hardware, and the actual architecture is kind of secondary. But there are some that I think also are presenting the fact that even promoting or taking advantage of the fact that while whatever this mode of transportation might be that's getting you from A to B, it's not going to be successful unless the user is happy about it. And so I feel like there's been a bit of a revival or a refocus back on this whole user centricity, that if my time is being spent or my money is being invested or whatever the scenario is within this environment space, it should be somehow catered to me. And I think whether you're a new customer within the automotive battlefield or you've been around for a long time, you have to start thinking about how you're going to differentiate your brand and why an end user is going to pick one over another. And I think a lot, and it's not just because of my background, but I think a lot of it's going to come down to what that ultimate user experience is, whether you're interacting with parts and pieces, your means for connectivity, your means for just being efficient in that space. So kind of circling around from your original question, I think ultimately the goal is to get people and occupants in whatever this device or mode of transportation is going to be, how they're going to go about building that. There's going to be some legacy things that are always going to be sticking around, and there's going to be some new opportunities for thinking about how to create that mode of transportation differently. I think it's really going to come down to what that user experience is going to be in the interior and how fabulous the materials are going to be.
Well, of course, and I think about that, and I almost see more customization of the interiors in the fact that they're going to be done in a different way, and people aren't going to look at the traditional assembly line approach to this, or some version of the assembly line approach where the various panels can be changed out, where you might have different graphics, you might have different effects, you might have interior designers, interior decorators for future vehicles that are more focused on creating a home environment almost in some regard. So
I can't recall the coach interior that used to be the leather coach.
Right.
I don't remember what. should know this, but what vehicle that was on.
Yeah,
that was a number of years ago. But it's almost bringing that back, that Michael Kors is going to design a whole new interior where you're going to come with pillows and blankets and all this, or you're going to be able to find some new modular switching out of surfaces at Target or something. As far as customization and personalization, which has always been a trend for a number of years, this, I think, is opening up a whole new level of opportunity for what that might mean.
And it's interesting, if I think forward too, in our industry, and I look at some of the processes that are revolutionizing our business, and I think about 3D printing and what that might play in terms of customizing interiors, and the fact that you don't have to build tools, that you can maybe at that point in time you're going to be producing parts as the customer waits, and you create a part for them as they wait to install into their car that never would have been thought of before. And now you got a completely different look in the interior, something that people can say, this is my
absolutely.
This is my little pod, and this is the way I like to roll. So we talked a lot about autonomous. I think there's probably 100 other things we can talk about. But there's this ride sharing and car sharing that is on the horizon that might have just as much impact on interiors or more than what we see in autonomous vehicles.
Yeah, it's definitely with the likes of Uber and what they're valued at these days, and the progress that they've had, the adoption that they've had from end users, and also the car sharing, that's emerged worldwide. It does make you start to think about the interior as far as reprioritizing where the value is really where the value should really be placed. Is the second row become a little bit more important than we've seen in the past? We've obviously, within the China market, chauffeuring second row has been a differentiator within that market in the past. So there's something to be learned from that industry as far as what ride sharing might mean for here. Second row has always kind of gotten a little bit. The money's in the front, and then you get whatever's left over.
That's where we put the kids.
Right, exactly. They don't. But that's where everything gets destroyed. But that might be another paradigm shift where there's more an enhanced focus or more creature comforts back there, or just another level of attention in, let's say, the ride sharing, how that vehicle is refreshed user over user. Car sharing too, whatever the sharing model is that is predominant, but how to keep that. We talked about how to keep it durable, how to keep it clean, how to keep it refreshed, how do you incentivize users or owners to kind of treat that with respect. There's a lot to be kind of explored in that whole realm, but certainly with the interior and possibly trading off where you're going to stick more money or more value in order to ultimately bring more users in.
Yeah, and in today's environment with especially ride sharing and car sharing as well, it's based on the configuration of the vehicle as it was designed out of the assembly plant. In the future, if those vehicles are going to be designed for that purpose, and whether they're autonomous or driven, I guess is another question.
Right.
Because then we get a mixture of autonomous and ride sharing.
Yeah.
But we get to the point now where I think that that back seating area, it does become very important. Even when I think about a London taxi versus a taxi here in the United States, they design those by purpose to give you that much more room in the back to be more comfortable, to have that chauffeured feeling around town, which again gets you to the point. If you think about designing it that way by intent, then the design is probably going to be different.
Absolutely, and a lot of it will come down to, I think, not only storage or efficiency innovations where maybe people want to be more productive or where they just want to completely escape and unwind, but it kind of goes full circle back to the materials then that are placed back there. What are you interacting with? What are you touching with? Or touching, what are you high touch points? And then, how that plays into just that overall experience, kind of looking at it holistically.
Well, certainly scratch and mar has been a challenge for the industry forever. and it continues to
Yep.
challenge, and will so even more so in the future.
Yeah.
When those surfaces get in a higher use mode than what they are today. Today, the back seat is probably the least used part of the vehicle and still probably has the most problems. Now, when it is the most used, and you got materials back there that can absorb what's happening in everyday use, then somehow you need to find materials that can.
Yeah.
And you need to take a different approach to what happens in that particular part. And maybe it comes with decorating that plastic part that goes in the back of the car.
Yeah.
Maybe it's not going to be a hard plastic part anymore. Maybe that's not what consumers want. Maybe consumers want a more luxurious feel back there, and so some of those issues that are associated with scratch and mar and hard plastic go away. Then it gets translated over to the skin people that have to figure that out from the skin perspective.
Right.
But the other thing I'm thinking about, if I'm Uber and I've got this great potential for advertising on the back wall of the front seats, or some entertainment venue where that becomes an entire video screen where either entertainment plays or advertisements play or whatever might play, in reconfiguring that whole space as the main focal point for the consumers in the back of the car.
Yeah, I mean, because right now it's terrible.
Right.
You see some aftermarket, it's loud, it's not integrated. I see the purpose behind it, or even, good old yellow cabs that got in the back there. It's like, turn this off.
Right.
But certainly, it could be an opportunity for that driver, but it also might just be an offering for that occupant, where you're then able to project something, work that you want to get done, or you're able to surf something, your own device that you've brought into the vehicle, now you can project it up and it's on a much larger display where somehow you're benefiting now from that surface not just being a traditional dumb surface, but having it be actually smart and transferring information or sharing information or receiving advertisements. But I mean, it's so exciting to just think about what those spaces that traditionally just didn't get a whole lot of attention, in the past, that we maybe just didn't have to worry about, that we can start really brainstorming their multifunctional use and how you're just bringing additional value add into the interior.
Well, it's certainly going to change cash cab forever.
Yes.
And rideshare karaoke,
Yeah.
I guess, too. But when we look at the preferences of the consumers now, going forward in the vehicle, in terms of the things that they can do now in this autonomous environment that they weren't able to do or aren't able to do today,
Right.
in an environment where they're the drivers. Can we think through that in terms of what does that mean in terms of how you design things? What are those things that people are going to demand now that they don't have to have their eyes on the road, that they can now be in an environment, a setting, which is a little bit either their office or their living room or their kitchen or their wine bar. I'm not sure which the three they want it to be, but can we imagine what effect that's going to have on designing future vehicle interiors?
Yeah, that's what is super fun, and we think about it a lot. We've done a lot of work and research globally on the topic, and it comes down to what we think the end user is really envisioning, because people still have a hard time wrapping their head around the whole notion of all of a sudden my vehicle or that I'm using is just going to take me on my way, and now I'm freed up to do whatever I want to do. And people can come up with just a laundry list of what endless amounts of things that they think that they might be able to or might want to accomplish, or what they would envision doing in the interior. I mean, things from learning a new language, learning how to play guitar, doing yoga, prepping food for dinner before I get home, or somehow or work. A lot of work, whether it's managing my family schedule or actually doing, finalizing a presentation, to everything from sleeping. A lot of people I just want to relax and disconnect and unwind. And interestingly enough, too, those kind of wish lists or what they envision themselves doing also change if you talk about a journey whether it's in the beginning of your day, at the end of your day, whether you're alone or you have occupants, whether it's a weekday versus a weekend, whether it's summer versus winter. So there are so many variables that come into play, and it can be daunting to think about, but what really we've kind of continued to stumble upon is a lot of what people are asking for can really be broken out into two categories, and that is, I'm either tasking, I'm trying to get something done, whatever that something is, but I'm trying to be productive in some way. So the vehicle interior needs me to kind of be at a position, more body position of being alert, focused, not distracted, having some sort of surface to work or get something, whether it's a computer or looking through papers, but somehow their body is in a position that's ready to be effective in whatever they're trying to get accomplished. And the other, so that's task, and the other is relax. And whether that's entertaining at your wine bar or sleeping or completely just Zen moment. But that's even the mood, the lighting, the smell, the ambiance, everything about the interior then changes, and especially your body position changes too. You want more leg room, you want more visual space. So that's kind of what we continue to play around with is how do you possibly offer both of those kind of extreme settings in one package, because someone might want to be very task oriented, let's say on their way to work or wherever they're going, and on the return journey they want to completely relax and unwind. So balancing those two, and then I think it comes back to surfaces, materials, products really are going to be tasked to be far more multifunctional than we've ever seen in the past.
It sounds like those panels are going to have to flip from morning to night.
Yeah, absolutely.
But it certainly tells us that as we look forward, there's going to be more need for comfort in whichever way it is, whether people are tasking or whether people are relaxing. There's going to be more of a need for comfort. And today, in this environment today, those come in the form of foams underneath surfaces, luxurious surfaces that are good to the touch, and somebody that have great haptics that people can feel and see, and they like everything about it. It's very pleasant. And that's the other part of what we haven't thought about in materials, is that things that are viewed pleasantly. We know from our consumer research that for the most part, people don't like hard plastic surfaces. They're the most economical way to do things. It's hard to get around.
Can you believe it?
To create that surface that is more luxurious looking and yet functional and durable and pleasant to the person inside the vehicle. And that's always going to be a challenge, because generally with those things comes a higher cost.
Right. We do also play around a little bit with, we've talked about smart services a little bit here. How far can we take the end user with, I don't want to say that we trick them, but with materials that present themselves, let's say, with glass. They acquire or have all of the characteristics of glass, but really are plastic. And what are the tolerances of an end user as far as acceptance of that, or materials that appear to be of metal nature, but it's just because they've been manufactured to suggest that, but they aren't exactly metal, and they don't require the additional cost. And so I think that's something that will be continued to be played around with in the future too, of there's a level of material authenticity. I'd love to have stone in my car, or granite, or real, but realistically, how is that going to actually play out? And is it okay if an end user knows that maybe that's not actually authentic, but it feels and looks and has the properties of everything to suggest, so I'm okay with that? So I think those are things to start to play around with as well.
And I think we've had some experience with that between the polycarbonate roofs that are coming into vehicles more and more. The technology's gotten better and better. It's more well accepted than it has been in the past. It's a better product than it was when it started, and so over time they've made the product better. To wood grain surfaces, which a number of them are two-shot molded parts behind a film, and those, depending on quality, some of them can be excellent, really well executed, and some of them aren't executed well at all, right?
Yep.
So, I think that we have to understand as suppliers that in the future, there's going to be a higher level of requirement in that particular application area, that the lower level quality is not going to be acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
People are going to expect higher level quality inside that vehicle. I think about plating on plastics, which is traditionally an exterior treatment for grills and bumpers
Mm-hmm.
and the like. But if you want metal surfaces on the interior, there is probably 50 different effects that you can get with plated on plastics that today aren't used very often. And if you gave the designers of the interiors all of these different finishes that they can get and create, I think that they would. I think they would adopt them.
Yeah.
Especially going forward, trying
Absolutely.
to create this more luxurious interior, more like what you'd find in your home.
Right. I think the other flip side to it is the reality of also, how do you continue to add value to an interior that is really stripped, where it is more of the economical, it is simply just getting me from A to B, but trying to figure out of the, getting me to A to B, it's kind of minimalist, but these are the top 5 things I need. I still won't give up.
Sure.
Comfort or connectivity or some sort of convenience or whatever it might be. So it's interesting to play kind of both sides of the spectrum.
I think that's a good point, because not everybody's going to buy the high-end luxury
Right.
interior.
Right.
Maybe that's an option, just like an engine option today, that you're gonna have from here to here, and you're gonna have the baseline, and then you're gonna have the high end, and you're gonna pay for the high end for sure, and but the baseline has to do what you want it to do.
Right.
It's got to have that certain function. It may not have the luxury, but it's got to have the function that consumer wants.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting way to look at it. I mean, I think there's probably a lot of truth to that, as far as if an autonomous setting, everything else becomes kind of normalized as far as what the vehicle, maybe size, but other than that, everything else is pretty much the same. So yeah, it's just differentiating what that interior is from a high end to a low end.
And is that going to be regulated based on the space available on the road for a particular size autonomous vehicle?
Yeah.
Does it cost you more to operate a minivan autonomous than it does a smart car?
segment or something, right. No, and then I think also it could be differentiated by various trim levels. It also could be the interiors are differentiated by going back to what do you hope to accomplish in that interior? What do you want that interior to be able to offer you or provide you?
Yeah.
More of a behavioral base than today. Traditional target markets are more set on demographic makeups, but so yeah, there's certainly a lot that's gonna be disruptive. Yeah.
It certainly isn't going to be the go to work tomorrow and do the same thing you did today.
Right.
For any of us. And we certainly can envision that happening in our future. And I think for our industry, it's extremely healthy. And whether you look at that from the automotive industry or the interiors industry or the plastic raw materials industry, we're all going to play a part in what is to be probably a revolution in the automobile industry and how they're being used.
Yeah, it's fun.
So it is fun. We're all excited. Just a couple more things. When I look at the vehicles of the future, and we look at the amount of glass that theoretically is going to be on these, do you envision that there's more, there's less, that space is taken up for communicating, or is that glass going to be used as a medium to communicate in holograms or the like, so that it's got dual purpose on the interior?
I would say, first of all, it's probably going to be dual purpose, I would imagine. It's, as far as increasing or less, I don't know. It depends, because I think there's also this aspect of how much do you really need to see outside or see your surroundings? How does that play into just kind of your mental state when you're in an interior automotive or autonomous vehicle? Yeah, I think, although, I mean, I just agree that it's going to probably take on a similar role to some of the other interior components, and that it's gonna be multifunctional, just by nature of the volume of it, or the smart, the surface of it.
Sure.
Just the ability it has to display information, or display pictures of your family.
There you go.
Or Skype with grandma when you're going down the road, I don't know, but yeah.
Terrific.
Great. Well, thanks, John and Renee. We have about 15 minutes set aside for questions. And again, please type your question on the right side of your screen under live chat, and we'll get to them in the order that they've been received. We have some that have come in already. One question here. What needs to be done to ensure that performance is not affected by new vehicle design for the interior? How can you ensure that these get the same level of performance when you're designing something brand new and disruptive?
Well, let me start with that. I think it does start with material properties and performance. Like any other new application that we have, there will be a whole set of property balances and specifications that are required that we have to meet. And I think that we're going to go through a period where it's going to be extremely difficult, because we're going to have all these new challenges with all these new applications. They're going to have to continue to meet both standards, the old standards and the new. And that's always the hardest, is when you're in that transition phase and you have to meet the exact same government regulations and yet meet the new requirements of the application.
And I think just realistically, I mean, you know this more than I do, of just balancing as far as what desires there are out there from an end user, and even a customer perspective, balancing that with what is reality,
Right.
and not ensuring any sort of degradation in what we're ultimately delivering to the marketplace. So.
Great. Someone has a question about autonomous vehicles and the future of vehicles in general as far as design goes. The question is, when the world is all autonomous, obviously you can make the argument that design will play a major factor in revolutionizing the industry, but how long, I guess the question is, how long do you see both cars and autonomous vehicles sharing the road? Will autonomous take over the world at some point here?
Well, there's forecasts that 20 years or so of the actual churn over of all old vehicles being taken off of the roads and autonomous on. As John and I have discussed, I think it's going to be a little bit more evolutionary in that you'll see environments or areas, whether it's inner city or whether it's the carpool lane gets converted into an autonomous lane. I think you'll see emergence of autonomous being introduced into the marketplace through means that are probably already available. I think it also depends on what region you're looking at. Things may be handled a little bit differently in China and Europe than maybe they are in North America, just simply because of infrastructure and what some of those countries have or don't already have available.
And I might be a little old school on this, but I do believe that people still enjoy driving their vehicles.
Yeah, yep.
Right? There's still a performance aspect of a love of a car.
Absolutely.
And there is still the freedom aspect of owning a car, being able to go where you want to go, when you want to go, and not have to be in the autonomous lane. So I think that there's going to be a portion of the car companies that may end up in the very space that they are, producing high-performance vehicles for a segment of the population that still wants them.
Yeah, absolutely.
The question I have with that too is, how far down the road is this? Are we have to wait for the OEs to come up with new car designs so we have more space in the rear seat, in the second row, so to speak, before we can move ahead with some of the components and the look of the interiors? Or can some of the components move ahead without waiting for the traditional OEs to get there as far as designing new vehicles?
Ideally, it works in tandem and in partnership. Early engagement with some of these customers is really going to be the key to success, whether the customers are, traditional or whether they're new to the industry as well. It's kind of a chicken and egg thing. As an interior supplier, we're always going to try to push the boundaries in where we think the interior can stretch and where we think it's going to be offering better solutions than what is today. And then, obviously, whether it's working with suppliers or working directly with the OE, early development is key in kind of going through this journey and in somewhat of the unknown together and try to ultimately to reach success in the end. So,
I also think that because there are new players, the traditional lines of working with existing car manufacturers won't be the only route.
Absolutely.
I mean,
Right.
there's going to be other
Yeah.
routes here
Yep.
where there are going to be other demands from other players for vehicle interiors or cockpit interiors or pod interiors or whatever you want to call them that are going to transcend just the traditional method of lines of communication today.
Renee, I think you brought up a point, we were talking about this earlier. Who are the designers of the future going to be? I know we're talking about car designers, but you mentioned Amazon, Bed Bath & Beyond, possibly. Maybe Uber's going to get in the game. I don't know. Who's that? Who are actually being really turned to as far as designing these, especially smart surfaces and some of the interactivity that we're expecting in the vehicle, I guess?
I guess I wouldn't say that anywhere in the near term we would see much of a change as far as really who is developing the interior, just because of all of the complexity that plays into that. You know, there's experts in the industry that know how to develop interiors for sure. But I think where there's new revenue streams or maybe new service opportunities with maybe, you know, Amazon, like you mentioned, or Bed Bath & Beyond, is if you start talking more about customization, modularity, refreshes, that whole user centricity of kind of creating the space that really caters to me. I think that might be where you may be able to see some new emergence in the coming years. But as far as traditionally developing and offering interiors to either new or older OEs, I think it will stick with kind of some of the key players that we still see around today. At least I hope so.
You know, in the soft surfaces, you're already seeing all the designers in the game, right?
Yeah.
Gucci's in the game and
Yeah.
Valentino's in the game. And,
Absolutely.
Right.
you know, in the soft surfaces. Now what we're talking about is the hard surface.
Right.
And the effect on that. And, you know, now all of a sudden you have more of an electronics version of the interior that you didn't have before. So
Yeah.
those are the people that might step into.
We have time for one last question, and this is, again, from an audience member. Do either of you, I guess, questions directed to either of you see any new materials being used in interiors besides the traditional polypropylene, let's say, or what's being used now? What innovations are you seeing that are helping drive some of the user experience that we're talking about with this?
Well, I think, yeah, let me try that. I think, you know, there's always a continued growth in new technology in the plastics industry. Some of that is driven by the needs of the interior. Some of it's driven by the process that gets used. So I think that we're going to need more durable materials, both in terms of surfaces and in terms of long-term durability that may not exist today, and we have to find a way to create products that are affordable and durable and decorable that are going to take care of the consumer needs of the future.
Anything you're seeing, Renee?
I just think you mentioned it, well, the deco part of it, of probably the introduction of maybe some non-traditional materials that are now of gaining some momentum, whether it's glass or granite or, you know, however that might manifest itself, but purely for decorative purposes. I think also the challenge of some of these surfaces that haven't been very smart in the past, that have some sort of radius to it, and how we're turning them into more of a functional surface, and how we're, you know, making what a flat screen all of a sudden appear now on a curved surface, and how that's going to be a challenge for the industry moving forward.
Don't give up on that curved glass.
No. Again.
I'm curious with that too, how big an impact will decorability have with the interior as opposed to some of the other features we talked about? Following up with that too is are the consumer needs changing that way? Are they looking for simpler materials? Are they looking for something that's more comfortable? Are they looking for something that's home office use? What is happening in that way? How does that affect decorability with some of this?
I think that you've got, as we talked about, you're going to have different levels of interiors. And so at the higher level, you're going to have more requirements for decorability. Obviously, there are challenges with some materials today from a decorability standpoint. They've found some ways to overcome some of those challenges with olefinic type products. And then with amorphous materials, they seem to decorate better. Are those going to be more in favor because they do decorate easier, or will the olefinic side come up with solutions to the polarity that exists in those products that restricts decorability? So I think that if there's enough of an emphasis on that, the industry is going to find the solutions for it.
As Renee, on your side of it too, is decorability as important as some of the other consumer features, what we're looking for in the future with the vehicle?
I think
Or
it's
other
increasing,
things?
it's certainly increasing in performance, and when you think about an autonomous interior and people envisioning what that space is gonna be like, they're constantly pulling from references from either a home environment or a work environment and the elements of that are gonna be critical in kind of recreating that third space that's now gonna be the autonomous interior.
Question, listening to your conversation, also, you talked about the rear of the car being used as an office environment, or maybe a writing environment, or something that you're using where you're doing something other than just sitting. Is impact resistance going to be critical with some of this, so you're not bouncing up and down while you're trying to do something, or have a drink, or whatever you're doing back there? How important is that when you're designing some of this?
I think it's going to be it's an interesting question.
It is.
Because if you truly are in a lower impact environment, which theoretically that's what autonomy is supposed to do for us, is reduce the risk of accidents, and therefore the need for impact, to me, in theory, should subside.
I think, though, the other part of it is not whether you're in the second row or you're in kind of the traditional first row space but not driving. Not to bring up something that we could go down and talk about forever, but the whole notion of motion sickness and taking your eyes off the road, and when you are trying to do something and you're bouncing up and down, and the frequency waves that you're encountering, that's still something to continue to work on. As someone who suffers from motion sickness, I hope it gets solved really soon. But yes, that's definitely an area I think customers are exploring. We're exploring of what are some ways to it's not going to be one certain thing, but elements that are going to lend itself to battling that issue.
I tend to fall asleep in the car myself, so maybe that'll be fixed.
That fixes it.
Question, we talked a little bit about electronics, but how much will that drive some of this interior design and plastics work that we're talking about? Because we need smart surfaces or other types of, again, interactive type devices that we have in the back of the vehicle. How's that going to interact with plastics, I guess, and what we're doing in this industry?
You want to answer that one?
Well, I think that there's a number, you mentioned impact with electronics. Certainly the need for materials that are impact resistant get higher with more electronics.
Mm-hmm.
Heat goes up
Mm-hmm.
when you use more electronics. And so I think there is that need for a different property balance when you're looking at an interior that is more electronic centric. I think that also you have to balance that with the comfort of those surfaces.
Mm-hmm.
And how do you get in an environment where you balance the functionality with the comfort and the aesthetics? And so that's going to be a big challenge for raw materials.
Yeah, it sounds like, Renee, there's a lot of different considerations when you're putting together this. It's more than just what we have today as far as what we're looking to do, and a lot of factors, variants, I guess,
absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
That's going to affect some of this. I'm curious, as a last question for both of you, what are going to be the predominant consumer needs going forward in the near term? I know we're a long way out with some of this, but near term we're probably going to see some of this take place already. What do you think, Renee, doing the research that you've done on this? What is going to be the drivers of what consumers want in the future, and how that might change today in the near term?
In a traditional automotive setting, or?
It could be either one. It doesn't have to be autonomous or something further down the road, but yeah.
I think there's always continuous improvement in elements of safety, convenience, comfort. I think a big, though, emphasis that I brought up earlier is just kind of the refocus back on the user centricity. There's a lot of information that's still coming at occupants and will continue to come at occupants in the vehicle, and interfacing with that information, being able to respond to it, being able to navigate it, just the usability of that interior space. Like I said, whether it's related to information or whether it's related to how you open your center console and being able to do that in an easy and innovative way. But just
kind of refocus back on that whole user and their experience in a very simplistic form and intuitive form of how they're expecting to interact with that vehicle. That I would then see only progress as the emergence of some of these disruptive technologies. So.
Okay, on your end, John, you're seeing from the material side of things?
Yeah, I think, one example I look at today where we've tried to bring more information to consumers via touchscreens, and yet when they do it, it looks a mess all the time.
And you have to dive down 5 layers to turn your radio down.
And so is there going to be something that allows us to get that same information without creating a surface that's an eyesore all the time? And so
Right.
you see some of it now with some of the hand signals that are being used
Gestural control and
to turn the radios and turn on the radios and turn signals and a number of different things. So I think you're going to see more and more of that. It may be bad for us Italian people because things will be going crazy every time we drive, but that's the way it goes. We'll figure it out.
Well, great. At this point, we're out of time today, but John and Renee will be happy to take your further questions offline, and we'll pass it to them. I want to thank our 2 speakers today, John Zestin and Renee Pipple, for their insights and for providing a great overview of disruptive technologies that will affect automotive interiors both now and in the future. I also want to thank all of you for attending this groundbreaking Fireside Chat, fueled by M. Holland and produced by Plastics News. We'll be holding the second in our series of Fireside Chats at noon Eastern Time on Tuesday, May 16th, live from Mexico City. Our next Fireside Chat will feature a live streaming conversation on polyethylene trends in Mexico and beyond, and will feature speakers from both M. Holland and Brascom. Thank you again, and we'll see you at a future Fireside Chat.